Thank you very much, and yes, also thank you very much to the Law Foundation for bringing me to New Zealand. I'm always very pleased to visit here. I love it here. I'm going to rip through some of these slides, and to begin with, I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about what AI is and isn't. And the reason I'm going to do this is just because it's important to understand how some of this stuff works in order to understand what you can and can't do with it and what you should be thinking about if you're using it or being somebody who's affected by it. So I'll talk about two different sorts of AI. A lot of people, when they think of AI, think of the sort of artificial general intelligence, the scary kind of HAL 9000 kind of thing. And for a long time we had sort of symbolic AI, which was a different way of thinking about things. So for a long time, when we tried to sort of imagine artificial intelligence, we tried to sort of think about well, you know, the dominant thinking was that the mind, the human mind, was located in the brain. And so there's this idea that you could replicate the way that the brain dealt with things, and then therefore you would be able to create an artificial intelligence. The issue there is that, first of all, the notion that intelligence is rooted in the brain is actually a relatively modern thing in terms of Western thought. It's something that we came to a couple of centuries ago, but it's a relatively recent kind of thing. And the second thing is that we're not actually sure what thinking is. And in particular, we're not sure what representing things are. We've been dealing with this since back before Aristotle. Wittgenstein had quite a lot to say about representation of things and what thingness is. And that makes it kind of hard to say, well, okay, we're going to define a bunch of things and then we're going to put some rules around them. And so for a long time, up until the late 1980s, the way that people tried to develop AI was to say, well, look, we're going to figure out the rules, we're going to have a set of rules, we're going to have a set of things we're going to define, and then the robots or the AIs or whatever it is will act on those rules. And that's that kind of old style Isaac Asimov kind of thing, where, you know, there'll be rules for robots and they'll follow the rules and they won't kill anybody, and that's all great. This kind of, you know, thinking sort of arose a lot earlier than that, but it was very much the dominant sort of way of working on things right through till the late 1980s. And then we have what's called an AI winter. The reason being that we hit upon those constraints. That first of all, you have to define all of the things in the world or all of the things in the domain that you want the AI to act on. You have to say, well, this is what this thing is, and here are the rules for dealing with these things. And if you see this, do that. And it turns out that's actually a really, really difficult thing to do. And so all of the original hype around we could get computers to do all of these fabulous things kind of fell in a hole. We had what's called AI winter. Everybody got very depressed about it. Now, not long after that, and in fact earlier this century, actually quite, when you think about it, not that long ago, 10 or so years ago, we started looking at other ways of dealing with this. Now, neural nets is where we sort of wound up, and I'll talk about how neural nets work. But the way that the way that these things work is that we instead of trying to teach the machine everything and say these are the rules you should follow and this is what this thing is, we let the machine learn. And so you'll hear a lot of people talk about machine learning and you'll hear talk about AI, and for most of the purposes that you'll hear about today, those two things are related. In order for an AI to act, it has to have a certain amount of machine learning involved. This is not true of every single piece of AI. There are still pieces of AI that are, essentially, if you like, coded to do certain things. But by and large, it's overwhelmingly where most of the growth is coming from. Now, not everybody thinks this is the right approach. So there are researchers, for example, like Gary Marcus, who still thinks that this sort of neural net thing is a dead end, and that you'll never get intelligence out of this. But Geoffrey Hinton, who's the guy who developed a concept called belief nets, which is based on neural networking, said earlier this year at Google I/O, it doesn't matter. Essentially, if a computer, for all intents and purposes, can learn all of these things and make all of these decisions, does it matter whether it's intelligent or not? What is human intelligence? As I say, philosophers have been trying to wrestle with this for a very, very long time. We're not there in philosophy yet. It's very hard to say that we're there in AI just yet. So, neural net, and one of the reasons that this is going to be important a little later on, a neural net is an attempt to mimic the way the brain works. And the idea, again, this theory, is that you're going to have a whole series of things making connections, like neurons in the brain, and making connections and feeding back to one another and sending signals all over the place. And the idea that these nodes have various layers and that they will make decisions and send information onto another node, and another node will do things with it and send it onto another node and all that sort of stuff. And then that there are weights attached to those sorts of decisions. So, as I said before, not all AI is based on neural nets. You might have heard of a thing in Australia that we call Robodebt. Has anybody heard of this? Anybody not heard of this? Robodebt was an attempt to basically set up a linkage between the Department of Social Services and the tax office to see whether or not they could work out whether people had been earning more money than they had actually been declaring on their social security claims. And it didn't work real well, but that's a whole separate issue. It was nevertheless not a thing based on neural networking. It was actually just if-then, and then divided by 52, which is or 26, which is one of the reasons that it failed. And you'll see some fairly primitive sort of forms in AI where it'll very simply just be that sort of standard sort of computer programming, if-then, go-to kind of stuff. Not the way, some recommendations engines still that work that way, but not the way that most of the things that you've seen growth, like in terms of vision recognition, image recognition, stuff like that, that's all neural network based. So, based on the neural networking sort of approach, in 2008, and to give you an idea of how fast things have advanced, has everybody heard about Alphago? So this was where Go being the game with the black and white things in the defined board, and they taught a computer to play Alphago, and it very quickly surpassed by analysing all of the various moves that could possibly be made, and learning from those and using a neural net that fed back the weightings on the best thing to do. They were able to then develop an AI that could outperform any human player. Now, what was interesting was less than a year later, they produced Alphago Zero. And what's interesting about Alphago Zero is it's still in a constrained domain. So a board game is a very constrained domain, right? It's got rules, it's got a set of, where's it go, 30 squares by 30 squares? I should know this, 30, there's a certain size. Chessboards are a certain size, all of these things. Those are fairly easy domains to learn in. They're not unbounded, right? And so, but what the point was, they taught Alphago Zero to play Go without actually telling it the rules, right? They gave it all of the various games that had been played that they could find and said, you work out what to do. And it taught itself to play Go. And it quickly became extremely good to the point where, you know, there's just no point in playing against one of these machines. They're going to beat you every single time. We puny humans. It turns out humans are actually quite good at other things, but we'll get to that a little bit later on. Anyway, the point is, that's a really big mark because it's a computer that is learning, right? It's a computer that is teaching itself without a lot of human input. Now, admittedly, within a constrained domain, but we can effectively design a machine now. Well, Alphago Zero can learn any board game, can teach itself any board game because board games have a set of rules. They're constrained, right? Not open-ended. If it came to something that didn't recognise at all, who knows what it would do, but it would do it, whatever it did, it would do probabilistically because the way that these neural nets work is it's all based on probabilistic matching. It's essentially just mathematics. What is the best way to do this? Now, to get you sort of the current state of the art, what we're really good at doing right now is things like fraud detection, we can do speech recognition, we can do image classification. So where Geoffrey Hinton's model originally came from, for example, was a set of challenges around a thing called ImageNet. ImageNet was a very big set of images that had been developed to train neural nets on that had been tagged, classified with certain things. And researchers tried to work out the best way to actually get machines to recognise images based on that. Recently, you might have read some stuff where some of the classification some of the classes that were given were based on a thing called WordNet, which was an earlier set of data. And there were some interesting cultural assumptions built into some of those words that have, in the last couple of months, made people go, huh, didn't realise it was going to work exactly that way, but that's one of the things that is interesting about teaching machines from existing data sets. Now, one of the ones I want to call out, one of the things I want to call out here is the notion of feature selection in machine learning. And feature selection is what data scientists will call the process of determining what's important in a data set. To lay people, this is what a lot of lay people will call bias. But for the purposes of having a discussion with people in data science, please don't do that. They get very upset. They don't do it deliberately. That's not the way that these things work. What they are looking for in a data set is the relevant features to weight to give the machine the basis for making a decision. Do people understand what I mean when I say that? Right? So it's that feature selection that's a really important piece here. Data cleansing is getting rid of the things that are perhaps pollutants in the, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's getting rid of things that may not be well defined. It's getting rid of things that the computer won't be able to relate to other things. But all of these steps are essential in developing any AI. So brings us to the OECD definition of what AI is. And I'm going to say that I think this is probably the most useful definition that I've come across. And by the way, you can just go online. If you look at, you'll find the OECD recommendation for the Council of Artificial Intelligence, and you can read their entire report. And it's not a bad one. It's long, but it's not a bad one. But it's a useful definition. Okay, so how do most machines learn? Now this is really oversimplifying here, but it'll be sufficient for our purposes here. So we have, one of the techniques is supervised learning. This is very common. It's where we have a training set of input data, right? We've got a whole set of data that says, here's the things that we feed the machine, and here's what we want the machine to come to as a result. And this is supervised learning. So we know what we want. We say to the machine, we want you to take people, person A, B, C, D through to W, and we want you to give us the characteristics of, the ideal person X for this particular, problem. So we know what we're aiming for. Very, very common, but you have to have the correct responses to the data in order to use supervised learning. For in many cases, you don't actually know what the results are. You've been given a really big data set and told, find the significant factors in this data set. Right? And that's unsupervised learning. You don't know the result that you're actually looking for. You're saying to the machine, find me the thing that is causing X. Right? Find me the thing. Now, this is probabilistic. It's the thing that is most likely to cause X. It's never definitive. This is all just essentially probability. And this is very popular for a lot of use cases. Now, there are things that you can do where you can actually get the machine to continually try putting input data and working out whether it's actually going to succeed until you get the desired response. That's reinforcement learning. And my favorite is generative adversarial networks. And the reason these are interesting is this is where you get a lot of progress in things like image recognition. And again, it's essentially getting two computers or two batches of machine learning to work with one another. And so the first machine is does the hypothesis. It generates I am going to generate a picture of a cat. And the second one is the discriminator. And it says, I've got pictures of real cats here, and yours is not a cat. Right? And then it says it back to the first GAN, and the first GAN goes, I'm going to try again. Is this a cat? And the discriminator says, not cat. And it keeps on going. The point is that it can do this for as long as you want to pay for, right? And it will get better and better and better at producing a cat until the discriminator can't tell the difference between a cat, right? So if you've seen deep fakes, this is how you make a deep fake, right? And this is how you make a deep fake better. All you ultimately need is a lot more data and a lot more time and a lot more machine processing. And so this is a fairly interesting development from the point of view of machine learning, because you try and figure out how the machines made that decision. Right? It's completely opaque to human beings. We don't know. This is layers upon layers upon layers of machines refining and refining and refining algorithms based on, we don't really know what, because it's the machines talking to the machines. It's phenomenally useful. This is how we can do image matching. This particular image set, by the way, which and you can't read, I'll make these slides available, but you can't, I actually hyperlinked in very tiny text underneath each of these images, the source material for these things. They're mostly from academic papers. But you can see on the right-hand column, the next to right-hand column with those numbers, for example, you can see the machine's best guess, and in the column with the yellow boxes is the actual result. So you can see how close the machine got to generating, for example, a 9 compared to the real 9 it was given. And you can see the faces, for example. The yellow faces, the real faces. and the faces in the column immediately to the left are the best guess. The ones progressively further on were the earlier guesses. So that's what that image is all about. And the difference between column 3 and column 5, I have no idea. The machine knows. I don't know. All right, so it's possible we're going to develop new mechanisms for new machine learning techniques. There are certainly a lot of data scientists working on these sorts of problems. There are a lot of problems we have not solved yet. But it's one of the issues that makes it really hard to regulate this space, because this is not a static field. There is still a lot of stuff to learn. And you know, I'm not going to say that these are all of the techniques, and I've really oversimplified a few of them here. But what you can see is true from a regulatory point of view is that several of these are not interpretable, right? They're not amenable to humans saying, it happened because of X. So, successes. I'm going to rip through these very quickly. My two favourites, we have a situation where it's very hard to identify great apes in the jungle. They're very good at hiding in the jungle, and there aren't very many of them, and we're not in fact sure how many great apes there are left. But with cameras and machine vision, machines are actually very good at recognising great apes, and we can now count them more accurately in the jungle and get a feel for whether or not they're actually endangered, or whether we're actually able to monitor their habits and their movements, etc. Giraffes, my other favourite. Apparently the patterns on every giraffe is different. I didn't know, it's like fingerprints. And so they're using machine vision and machine learning in the field to track the movements of giraffes, because it's actually quite straightforward to do, right? Excellent. Yay, giraffes. Robotic house basically designed and constructed pretty much entirely by robots. Some supervision required, a bit like IKEA, but you know, the robots actually did assemble most of the bits. And of course, Google's Google Lens, which is currently just in a prototype, but it's a fantastic translation device. You can just hold your phone over a sign in a foreign language, and it will translate it for you on the fly. Fantastic for monolingual people like me. Only works in certain languages so far. And, oh, there we go. Plant disease detection, CSIRO project. Robotic nurseries, which involve both the detection of things and also how much water should you give a thing, and are you giving it too much, and yada yada, and feedback loops around all of that. And this one from the Philippines, which is a test project which is being partially funded by Google, which aims to go through rubbish heaps and work out what's recyclable. Again, machine learning. The Go we've already heard about, and two that will terrify you. Well, one good one, but not so great if you're a radiologist, which is oncology machines after some initial alarming problems with doctors not trusting the results. Turns out machine vision is very good at oncology, very good at spotting tumours. It refers them obviously back to actual oncologists, but at the moment machines are doing very, very well in this space. And for any of you in the audience who are lawyers, not only is legal research going the way of the dinosaur, but a lot of actual legal work is going the way of the dinosaur, because machines are getting really good at doing that as well, since a lot of legal work is just finding cases and relating them to the case at hand. Turns out you can actually automate that pretty slickly. All right, failures, very quickly again. This is one of my favourites, and probably one I will hopefully reference at the Law Foundation tomorrow. As you know, China has a lot of facial recognition cameras. AI is not actually that good at discriminating context unless it's told what the context is, unless you're setting up a particular machine learning thing to learn about that. In this particular case, an advertisement featuring the photo of a Chinese billionaire on the side of a bus the bus happened to be stopped on a pedestrian crossing. The government of the province then issued a fine for jaywalking to the billionaire, who wasn't, of course, not on the bus crossing. But of course, the robot doesn't know that. It's just the face, recognise the face, great, it's on an ad, it's that person, it's a pedestrian crossing, bing. You will probably mostly have heard about Amazon's HR debacle. Now, what's interesting about Amazon, and the reason I'm going to talk about this one is this will come up later in project governance. One of the things, of course, Amazon has squillions of dollars, and I think it's actually only trillions, but they do have trillions of dollars. And they have a team of data scientists, and they developed a HR tool, and they identified bias in the tool after they built it, and they said, well, this is terrible, we have to do something about that, and they tried retraining it, but no matter how many times they tried retraining it, they were always going to get bias in the tool. And the reason they were going to get bias in the tool was they were working from historical data, and historical data, by definition, has all of the biases from history built into it. So Amazon did the mature thing and threw it away. They actually wrote it off and said, we're going to kill it altogether. It doesn't work, right? And what's interesting about that is, okay, they could afford to do that. The other thing is Amazon took the view that one of the biggest risks to them is that the big battle in Seattle is to hire talent. You're competing with Microsoft, you're competing with Adobe, a whole bunch of companies that are located there. And if you're missing talent because your AI is biased, that's a potential tremendous cost to your company. So they had a reason for throwing it away. The other one is the Compass sentencing tool, which you probably will have read about as well, which unfortunately was again based on historical data. Most of the people that had previously been arrested for certain crimes were black, for example, and it tended to not deal with people of colour very well in its decision-making process. And I'll quickly scoot through some of those because we are running things. I'll just talk briefly about Tay, Microsoft Tay, who you probably also will have heard. Tay was a chatbot that Microsoft decided to train on Twitter. And the problem with this was they were training with live data, right? So they'd done it, they worked on it for a while, and then they released it onto the internet and said, now everybody converse with Tay and it will talk back to you, and isn't this fun? Of course, the lovely people at 4chan and various places thought this is awesome, and within 24 hours, Tay was a raging racist, right? Microsoft took it offline, tried to retrain it, re-released it to the world, and Tay became a stoner. So don't train with live data unless you're really prepared to deal with the consequences. Okay, that's the little lesson there. Fixing a broken model, a model that you've trained on one set of data, trying to retrain it is actually really difficult. It's really, really difficult. You kind of have to go right back to the beginning and start all over again. And you can see how this would have some pretty big challenges for governments, for example, who tend not to do projects that way. Right? Oh, I have just built this project and I've launched it on the world and it cost me $10 million and now I'm either going to have to throw it away or I'm going to have to spend another $10 million and amass a new data set to train it with. You can see how this would be problematic. So, all right, terrifying developments. I'm not going to spend too much on this one, but this one is my favorite. GPT-2 is a language generation tool. It's the ability to generate synthetic language. So we've heard about deepfakes. This is actually a Reddit thread. So they've been training it on Reddit data. I'm fascinated by the fact that Reddit let them do this because this is the death now. I think Reddit's a cesspool, but this is the death of Reddit because nobody except bots is allowed in this thread. This is all bots, totally bots. And these things tell better jokes than I do. Every now and again they tweak the algorithm and the whole thing falls apart. So if you go and visit this thread and look for GPT-2 simulator on Reddit, you'll find it. If you go and visit it, on any given day, it might actually just be a bunch of gibberish. And the rest of the time, it's just like the rest of Reddit. Making jokes, making references, posting GIFs, how do you pronounce them, memes, you know, this can do anything you can do. And as I say, it tells better jokes than me, which is my heart. Yeah, now when they released GPT-2, the team that did it said, look, we're not going to release the source code for this publicly because it's too dangerous. The ability to generate synthetic text like this that will absolutely fool anybody is too great. And we're going to restrict access to this, and we're just going to try and test it out. Independently, of course, now there's at least 5 groups that we know of that have done similar things, and you can be pretty sure that the Russians and the Chinese have absolutely got tools like this. And it's, you know, deepfakes are not the entire reason to be scared of AI, but they're certainly an interesting one. All right, so in action, most of the governance models around AI propose 3 ways of looking at AI. There's human in the loop, which means that the AI makes a recommendation, the human then looks at the decision and looks at the AI's recommendation and makes the decision, right? That's human in the loop. Human on the loop, which is the AI makes a decision, but the human can review the decision, which is different. In the first model, the human's making the decision based on a recommendation from the AI. In the second, the AI is making the decision and the human has oversight, which is different. In other words, The AI might be working very quickly, and the human might just review some of those decisions, not all of them. And the other one is human out of the loop, right, where the AI is doing all the work, and there are no humans involved. And look, recently, when the European Commission looked at this, they basically reviewed those models, and what they said, is the less oversight that a human can exercise, the more testing and governance is required. So you might say, well, the last model is certainly the cheapest to run because it's just humans and there's just robots and there's no humans involved. But on the other hand, you're going to have to spend a lot of money on governance and a lot of money on testing. And so the total cost of that project over time is something you've got to factor. And if you skimp on the governance, you're playing with fire. Right? So don't let people tell you that the total cost of AI is necessarily always cheaper. There are many ways to look at how you frame these projects. So, algorithmic transparency, I talked about interpretability before. So one of the challenges, if we can't understand how a computer makes decisions, how can we determine whether it's doing what it should be doing? How can we appeal those decisions? How can we go through all the things that we in a democratic society expect as a sort of fundamental premise of government, but also of justice by, natural justice in terms of our ability to fight corporations and things like that. Now we think in terms that computers can't think necessarily. If you can't define it for the computer, then it's very hard to say. So Bean Kim runs a thing called, Google Brain has a project called TCAV, and she's one of the researchers at Google Brain, and she says you can't teach a machine about what love is. You just can't. You can teach a machine to approximate what other people think about love, but it's not necessarily the same thing. So one of the ways we can determine whether or not the neural net can work is to assign a confidence measure. Right? We can say, well, we think probabilistically this is how confident we should be, and we can validate that with some human input. And so Jan LeCun, who's the chief scientist of Facebook, says there's no explainability problem. I can always go and look at, in those deepfakes, I can look at pixel X at this particular area, and I can look at the weightings applied to that, and I can determine, well, he's a data scientist, right? He's one of the best data scientists in the world. Of course he would say that, and he probably can. You and me, not so much. Judge, possibly also not so much. Now, the other thing is some applications are more critical than others, right? I mean, I don't like black jelly beans. If I build an algorithm to sort jelly beans for me, and I accidentally get a black jelly bean, yeah, well, okay. Mild inconvenience. On the other hand, if I'm sentencing somebody to life imprisonment, slightly more at stake. All right, so explainable AI now is the big focus for AI, and people are afraid that if we don't get this right, we will have another AI winter because it will be too dangerous to deploy some of these systems. And in fact, I had a briefing from a fairly infamous American company a while ago called Palantir, who some of you may have heard, who makes some particularly disturbing tools for immigration in the United States. But they also make fraud detection tools for financial services. But they have a lot of trouble selling those tools into financial services because they can't explain to people in financial services how they work because they're based on neural networking, right? Which means they can't really sell them, because nobody in a bank wants to buy a thing where they can't explain to their boss or to the head of risk at the bank why they made that decision. So when we talk about an AI winter, we're not just talking about people doing it irresponsibly. In fact, these are commercial problems as well. This will inhibit the growth of AI if we can't do explainability. So there's a lot of people working on it. DARPA, who of course are the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, have a big series of projects. I think there are 27 universities involved in this, all doing different parts of it. Google has a huge piece with Google Brain. Microsoft's got some work. Everybody's trying to do work in this. And I think I mentioned TCAV before, which is Trusted Concept Activation Vectors, which is a name that only an engineer could love. Anyway, the point being, if you can, all that Google Brain is trying to do is to understand enough to safely use the tool. They're not trying to get to the yes, pixel X indicated Y kind of thing, because frankly, nobody's going to pay attention to that. And one of the biggest challenges is actually working out what do you put in a dashboard. If you're going to put a dashboard up that says these are the things that weighted the decision, but you want people to be actually able to understand that at a glance, as opposed to taking like 5 hours to work through all of the things. If you're going to have that human on the loop, which is what's absolutely necessary, explain to the human, well, this is how I made, these are the weightings, this is the feature selection that was involved. 74% probability of X, blah, 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 blah. You absolutely need to work out to make that intelligible to a human being. If it looks like the kind of dashboard that you might find in, say, 1990s kind of software, it's not going to work. So working with anthropologists, working with social scientists to unpick some of the stuff, it's not all about data scientists here. There's a big piece here to do with the human-computer understanding part. So, ethics frameworks. Everybody has an ethics framework. The UK have done some studies on this. The EU has done, and the OECD have done some pretty good studies. I have to say the EU one, the EU one is worth having a look at. Again, quite dense, but worth having a look at. The OECD one, as you might understand, is kind of obviously focused on some of the economic aspects, the economic benefits of some of these things. It's not to say it's bad, it's just, it's an interesting thing. So the EU had, a particular kind of goal in mind, which was the communications, they wanted to have transparency around what the expectations of the AI were to be, and to be honest about that. Now, one of the challenges for democracies is that our governments are not always really upfront about the programs that they put in. They tell you it's to do X, and it's going to make, usually they give them nice slogans, like, trusting the community, which probably means auditing the heck out of everybody. Right? There are various things. So this is not really compatible with the way that we spin messaging in a lot of government activities or corporate activities. Facebook will tell you, for example, that it's all about sharing. No, Facebook's all about advertising. 98-point-something% of their revenue comes from advertising. They are not a sharing company, they are a data harvesting company. So being transparent means many things to many people. EPIC have got a set of principles that they're trying to get a lot of companies and governments to sign up to. Not sure how that will go, but their Montreal Declaration is kind of interesting, worth having a look at. Canada has some guiding principles and actually have tried to develop an algorithmic impact assessment tool, which is a bit like a PIA. In privacy, we have the privacy impact assessment tool. They're trying to do an algorithmic impact assessment tool. A little early to see how this is going to work and how you could actually apply it in the real world. And again, it requires a degree of honesty. Like a PIA, it requires you to be quite upfront and transparent about what it is, what the real goals are that you're trying to achieve. But, interesting thing to have a look at. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Australian attempt to do this. They've got a draft out at the moment. My office made a submission back to this. And I'm going to critique it because I think it's terrible. All right? So, it has a series of principles. Now, most of these principles, you will see there's quite a lot of them, are in those other frameworks. The EU one is a lot shorter, which is to its benefit. And I'll just quickly walk through these right now. So generate net benefits. For whom? For whom? Our Department of Social Security would probably say that reducing fraud is definitely a net benefit to the society, right? At what cost? At what point does that benefit exceed the damage that may be done to people who are, who may suffer as a result of the application of the AI? And there are some issues there around contestability, but even just at its base there, what is the problem we're trying to solve, and who are we trying to solve it for? It's a bit like when you work in government and you've got a really good evidence-based policy, and the minister says, that's great, but that's not my party's platform. Right? Now, this is democracy. That's what we elect people to do. That's perfectly proper and reasonable. But if you're implementing somebody's platform based on prejudice, the machine will generate those benefits for that particular cohort, and we have the right to throw them out in democracy, and that's what it's available for. But it may not be a net benefit for society. And we lurch from party to party in democracies quite regularly as we reassess what the actual benefits of particular parties were. So it's not a new concept, but it's a really important one, and we probably actually lack the philosophical framework. So the idea of having this as a principle, doesn't it sound laudable? The project must generate net benefits. For who? Really, really key thing. You're not going to actually make AI better unless you can figure out some way of actually applying that. Do no harm. Now, the problem with AI is, again, it's probabilistic, and it's going to weight things, and some harm is inevitable. The fact that it's probabilistic, you're always going to have some false positives and some false negatives. Now, smart gates. Everybody been through the smart gates? Yeah. Generally work pretty well. AI, facial recognition is much easier in a static context like that. But of course, people fail. Right? Now, The process we have in most countries for dealing with that is actually relatively straightforward. You go to the counter and it's inconvenient, but it's not catastrophic, right? You go to the counter and, well, maybe it is catastrophic in the case of the Hmong refugee, for example, who tried, not refugee, Hmong woman who was actually legally entering the United States, who they decided because she looked so young, her passport must not have been genuine, and so went into a home for 4 years because they kept on reclassifying her age. Because Hmong women look very young because they're very short and they just happen to look very young. Anyway, my point being, you can have catastrophic, there will always be false positives and false positives and false negatives. And so when you're designing your program of work, you've got to have your remediation pathways for those false positives and false negatives thought out in advance. What will we do to the people who are unfairly singled out by the AI the wrong way? You have to have that worked out in advance. If you don't, you're consigning people to a Kafkaesque nightmare in which they have to prove something. And human beings, unfortunately, tend to believe the results of the machine. And this is true, actually, not just of machines. Human beings, unfortunately, and there are good psychological studies to back this up. There's a fascinating paper published by the CIA in the 1960s where they actually did a whole bunch of research and determined that the first thing people hear is what they tend to believe, and that trying to counteract that is much harder than giving them the opposing view first. So, same problem. The machine says, hey, this person's passport doesn't match their face. There's an implicit bias there on the part of the person receiving the information. Now, the flip side of that, I mentioned oncology before. One of the things that happened in oncology, some of the first tools they made had a lot of false positives. And of course, oncology is a particularly sensitive area of medicine. Identifying a tumour does mean the difference between life and death in a lot of cases. And the first set that they released into the market were pretty terrible. And so a lot of doctors didn't trust them. And this is the flip side, is that you can get people who then say, I don't trust this AI. And so therefore the value of your program, the expenditure that you've made is wasted. So there's benefits to getting this right from the beginning. Now, regulatory legal compliance, everybody said we need a new legal framework. Well, you know what? In Australia, we probably don't. I'm saying probably. Now, I haven't been through New Zealand law, but we already have a whole set of rules that say, here is what people must do in Australia. If your AI does not do this, if your AI is discriminating on the basis of sex, you should either throw it away, if you can, or you should fix it if you can. But as I say, it's very hard to fix a broken model. So these things still apply. I have yet to see that we necessarily need a lot, certainly in Australia, that we need some new AI transparency law. In fact, it'll be interesting to see how some of the cases that are before the courts actually work their way through. Unfortunately, the Administrative Appeals Court in Tribunal in New South Wales has already made an interesting decision in relation to transparency, which I'll touch on briefly in a moment. But I'll just go with this nice quote. Data and Society is a sort of a think tank in the United States, which produces a lot of really interesting writing in this space. And I thought this was the loveliest piece, because even though we might understand these human rights principles, developers, if they're not actually familiar with this space, may not know how to actually write the code or develop the machines that actually lead to these kind of outcomes. And that suggests that we actually need much more multidisciplinary teams developing these things. And it's not enough to have them reviewed, you actually probably need to embed people in those teams in order to make those things possible. So responsibility, well in Australia we already actually have some responsibility. Bizarrely enough, the Department of Finance passed some guidelines which were last updated in 2007, which actually makes the Secretary of the Department responsible for the AI. However, as we've seen in the case of the robo-debt example, the robo-debt is interesting because so far, whatever it's actually got to court, the Australian government has settled so as not to actually test the law. It'll be very interesting to see how long they can keep that one up. So the Secretary is not actually technically responsible yet. The other point is, how can a Secretary take responsibility if nobody in their agency knows how the thing works? If there's no actual visibility as to this is the way that this decision was made, how can anybody be assumed to have taken responsibility in a real meaningful sense? We can hold them legally responsible, but is that helpful? Is that ultimately the right way to run these kinds of systems? And I have to say, that just presupposes we're going to take everything through the courts, which is probably a less than fabulous outcome. So the point that that raises is that most of these governance proposals suggest that, you know, we're going to be able to recognize AI. The point is, you are surrounded by AI right now. Right? When your phone gives you the weather, right, weather's a bad example, I can tell where the data comes from. When your phone tells you, when Google tells you how long it's going to take to get from point A to point B on your phone, assuming you're using Google Maps, and they get it wrong, do you sue Google? Well, there's not much at stake, right? Good luck with that. That's just a lot of money up against that gigantic. But if it was a more consequential decision, would you? Right? The point being, most people don't know that Google Apps is an AI. They think it's like an old sort of style street directory kind of thing. They don't think the sat-nav in there, because sat-navs tend not to be as smart, well, most of the old sat-navs tend not to be as smart as, for example, Google Maps, because Google Maps are working on dynamic data, and most sat-navs are working on, most of the old ones are working on static data. So people don't always recognize when an AI is there. If you ask people how much AI is in their smartphone, I mean, even just taking a photograph, most current smartphones apply an enormous amount of AI to just taking the photograph. All that 3-camera stuff that you're seeing now, tons of AI behind all of that. How does it make one image? Well, it's actually a bunch of separate images that it stitches into one image. So, privacy protection. De-identification. You may not understand the broader context for all the data. More to the point, there's some really interesting problems with challenging an AI. You might actually have to give up more information in doing the challenge than the AI originally exposed. But the bigger problem is that the AI may actually generate feeds that may incidentally expose the identities of people. My office published a book not too long ago, an ebook, which is on our website, which is called Closer to the Machine. And there's a chapter in there that I can recommend that you have a look at on adversarial attacks, written by Professor Ben Rubenstein of Melbourne University, which deals partially with that very subject of how could I know which individuals were in the data set that this AI was trained on, and what would that tell me about them? I'm not going to go into we could be here for hours, and Ben is much better at it than I am. Fairness, no unfair discrimination. Well, the problem is, again, you're doing feature selection. We will call it bias, data science will call it feature selection, but you need to have tested it with edge case data. And we tend not to do that. We tend to think that that's a waste of money, right? But again, unless you want to be the cockroach in a Kafka novel, you know, because somebody is going to be the cockroach if an AI is making the decisions. So again, consider those false positives and false negatives and work out, you know, have some empathy for people who are caught up in that. When I said before, figure out the pathways, again, do that from an anthropological basis, because people from different cultures may have very different responses to some of these things. And that brings us to this point. This is a little test that MIT did. Look, it's based on the trolley car. Trolley cars are really, everybody in data science rolls their eyes when you talk about the trolley car problem, which is, you know, who do we kill? Do we kill the old person, the young person? What's really interesting about it, though, was this was a global study. And of course, what they discovered was Americans are going to be like, do I run the old person down or the young person down? And Americans say, always run the old person down, right? Because their life is almost over and they're worthless to society. Chinese people, totally the opposite. Right, children, get rid of the children, save the old person, venerate the old. Now, there's a terrible social stereotype there, but by and large, the point being that all of these features that we're selecting are culturally determined. And so one of the questions you want to ask yourself there is, what are the cultural features that New Zealand wants? Right, what are the things that we think are important? Now, given that you'll be buying a lot of this software from the United States, does that match what New Zealand wants as the kind of cultural features that you want to see in AI that is used by your population? Because if you don't make some of those decisions up front and talk to the vendors, then at a certain point you'll wake up in 20 years' time to find that your culture is American. It's just going to happen because all the decisions will have been made for you by American AI. So I'm not being alarmist here, except to say that having visited America quite a lot and having visited New Zealand quite a lot, I see some fairly profound differences. All right. Now, procurement and trade secrets obfuscation. One of the things is, how do we get access to the code if it's being made by a private company? They may say, well, it's trade secret. And Facebook, of course, and Google do this quite a lot, and Facebook's been doing it a lot in relation to some of the inquiries for example, by the ICO and some other groups like that. Oh, well, this is proprietary, it's a trade secret, we can't share. It's the 11 different herbs and spices or the Coca-Cola recipe, right? Should governments be buying things on that basis if they can't explain to their citizens how it makes a decision? Now, in New South Wales recently, state of Australia, there was a case before the Administrative Appeals Tribunal in which somebody wanted to question the algorithm that was allowing the police to direct some of their resources. Essentially, it was looking at crime and saying, well, this is where you should do this and this is where you should do that. And the Administrative Appeals Tribunal held that because it was a private company providing the software, that it was a trade secret and did not need to be exposed. Interestingly, under competition law, there was recently a case featuring Trivago, which is the travel site, where the competition regulator was able to get access to the source code in confidence. They weren't able to release it, but able to get access to the source code to determine that in fact Trivago was not giving people the best price. But they needed to get access to the source code to understand that, because only by doing that could they see the weightings, the source code and the data set. Right? So they had to compel both of those things. This is an expensive process. It means you need to have a team of data scientists who your regulator, or you need to have access to them to be able to say, even if I can get the source code, I need to have experts who can go through it and say, this is what this thing actually does, and it's not doing exactly what the company said it was doing. So this is interesting. The private sector, it's very interesting in the public sector. The other point is, if you're procuring software that you don't actually understand, you mightn't understand the vulnerabilities. So from a cybersecurity perspective, you may be exposed. And again, I would recommend the chapter from Ben Rubenstein in her book. And the other point is that the number of data points or processes that you actually have to analyse may surpass human understanding. And even when you employ the data scientists, they may have to labour for years to unpick what's actually going on. So are we ready for that? I'm making it all sound terribly gloomy and doomy, aren't I? Look, it's not. As I said before, there are fantastic things we can do with AI. But we must not allow ourselves to come at this governance process late after the event, because decisions will have been made for us by that point. This is something that needs attention right now. Now, the Data 61 report found that we shouldn't open up pop-up scrutiny because that will help people explain how to exploit them. This is nonsense. Everybody in cybersecurity knows that open software, where people can critique it, is the best, is the most secure software, because you become aware of vulnerabilities and you fix them. This is the opposite of good security practice. And everybody knew how TAE worked, and it got gamed. So, I said before, people are likely to have a bias. The other thing is contestability only works when there are accessible pathways to that contestability. And again, when you're designing your program, I mean your computer program, I mean whatever you're using the AI for, whatever your social program is or your law enforcement program, whatever it is, you've got to design that contestability pathway at the same time. Otherwise, contestability is for rich people with good lawyers, right? Which is not what we want as a society. We want a just society. All right, accountability, I mentioned that before. I won't go into too much detail. But accountability doesn't really work where the thing hasn't been designed. Where the thing has learned a lot of characteristics, there's no person to point to and say, well, you made that design decision. Right? Where we get to AI actually learning, properly learning in sets of consequences, for example, about how to optimize traffic on a toll road or various other bits and pieces. Who do we point to when it makes the wrong decision? How can I, as an executive, if I'm the executive of the toll road, be held responsible when I have no idea how the thing works? I'm not a data scientist. Do I take the word of the data scientist who's solving the software? Well, that's great, but it's a bit brave. You can see how the accountability piece is going to have some really significant issues in the courts as these things become, litigated. Now, unless we want to give AIs personhood, which is kind of a bit problematic, but will we throw an AI in jail? What does throwing an AI in jail mean? Turning it off? Well, then the freeway doesn't work at all. What do we do here? Okay, so the UK Government's Data Protection Act has a piece about this, but it basically says reconsider the decision or take a new decision. That's great, it's expensive, people will fight things that are expensive. All right, almost at the end of this now, because I'm running short of time, I think. So vulnerabilities, confidentiality attacks I mentioned before, where you can work out who was in the training data, what the characteristics were. You may actually expose the information of people if you can get access to that. Integrity attacks, So one of the things that you might want to do, and is very, very common in cybersecurity, is, let's say I want to defeat your spam filter. One of the things I can do is, over time, start feeding you little bits of spam to work out what it is that triggers your filter, right? What's the threshold? And by doing that over time, I can work out what I can do sufficient to not trigger your threshold. Now, spam is just one example, but there are many forms of AI where I could do this. So, for example, if I wanted to look at facial recognition, I could try doing it, X number of times. Now, most people build in rate limiting and stuff like that into their systems to prevent this from happening a lot. And you definitely want that. You don't want somebody to be able to submit, say, 500 images in 5 minutes, because that would be bad. Because they'll find the one that actually unlocks the thing. And this is like your iPhone takes 6 million hours to unlock if you enter the PIN code, or if your 5-year-old enters the PIN code too many times. Similar kind of principle, but you can have integrity attacks in that sense. Availability attacks, that's something that causes people to lose trust in the AI. So, for example, if the AI is not available to make the decision, then that will have an impact on things. Adversarial examples, so altering the inputs in subtle ways over time. This is very common in cybersecurity for malware injection. It also is very easy to do with voice biometrics. So again, I try a voice biometric, I just adjust it a tiny bit, and I eventually work out the thresholds and the kinds of things. And again, this is a bit like a mathematical puzzle. Essentially, I'm reverse engineering the model to determine which voice biometric will pass that test. There are ways to protect against this, but these are all things that need to be built into a project plan. Poisoning. Particularly when you've got dynamic data, which is constantly being fed to the AI. If you can start feeding it ever so slightly off data, you can eventually alter the outputs of that AI over time quite dramatically. So to take a non-personal example, if I was artificially sending it, for example, housing data that wasn't correct, I could completely influence the mortgage market in New Zealand, right? Now, I'm not saying that would happen, there's probably lots of ways you can protect against that, but that's an example of if I started introducing ever so slightly different sales data, that would have a big impact on how banks priced their mortgages. So you can see how this could have whole of economy kind of impacts, and why this would be attractive to nation states to do over time. That's just one example. This is almost my time up. So one of the challenges in the Commonwealth is that in the Commonwealth of Australia, for example, where I worked briefly, when I was doing doing proposals, was that I had to make a policy case with offsets. And once I've done that, that usually has those offsets. So, for example, you're going to spend $300 million on this, but you're going to save $3 billion over 10 years. We have forward estimates in Australia where you have to project out, right? So I do that, and they like my proposal, and it's a go. And so I get part of my $300 million. Sometimes I get all of it in that cabinet in that year. But baked into now the Department of Finance's or the Treasury's estimates for the foreseeable future is a return of, say, $1 billion a year for the next 4 years. And I get to the end of my AI project and I realise that the thing's hopelessly biased. And I've spent my $300 million. I'm out of money, don't have any more. And as we've seen, just tinkering with the data probably isn't going to do it in a lot of cases. And governments don't really believe in sunk cost. It's not a thing that governments do. Governments tend to think of it as a national asset that I've just built, right? But to kill it, I need to find $1 billion each year over the forward estimates. I can't just return the $300 million I've spent it. And even if I could, that wouldn't actually, Treasury would not accept that. Treasury has baked in that $1 billion saving over the forward estimates. So you can see that it would have to be an incredibly brave minister to say, kill it. Because he'd have to fire a whole bunch of other public servants or scrap a bunch of other programs in order to scrap the AI that I've just built that's flawed. So you can see the moral hazard that we're baking into some of these things. They're not like normal IT projects, where if it doesn't work, you can bring in a bunch of consultants in and say, hey, what can you fix? What can you glue this, just bits of gaffer tape and wire, please. Whatever will make this thing run. AI does not work that way. If it's a biased algorithm, fixing the bias in the algorithm will be very, very expensive and very, very tricky, and almost as expensive as building it from scratch in the first place. So this is an uncommon hazard, and what it suggests is that we probably need a more iterative process. implementation, you know, there's all sorts of issues with that, and who gets to oversee it, and what do they want? So who's defining that? What is this project for? And those are the sort of the impacts of things. Who looks after it after it's running? 10 years down the track, all the people who built this thing have gone. They like they've retired, they may have gone off to work for a management consultancy, whatever. Nobody understands how these decisions were made. Nobody understands what the factors were in that AI. If you're feeding it new data that is different than the data from 10 years ago, you're almost certainly getting a biased result because it wasn't trained with that new data, it was trained with the old data. So you probably need to iterate on that. Governments need to plan for these things. And the other thing is governments fund projects on a project basis and then expect agencies to absorb the ongoing costs of those projects. And good luck affording the data scientists who are paid very well by companies like Google and Facebook over the full lifespan of the AI to keep an oversight on that. Very, very challenging. All right, that's enough of this. Oh, I went backwards there, sorry about that. That's about enough of this. That's the end of my proposal. I am prepared to take questions briefly. I think we're coming to the end of our timing, but please, any questions that you would like. If you want to just heckle, that's perfectly fine as well.
That's great. We've got a couple of questions from the app and one from the floor as well. So,